Okay, one of the things that conservatives talk about constantly, is that the culture is always moving left, one step at a time, and that conservatives need to resist it, otherwise society will fall apart. They call this effect the political ratchet, and it works in the following ways. The far left will make an absurd demand, and then after temporarily and weakly resisting the demand, the right eventually caves in and agrees to what they believe is a compromise.
What happens is the libs introduce some crazy idea, and then the conservatives briefly stand firm, they briefly oppose it, then the liberals totally stand firm, and then the conservatives cave, and then the conservatives will say, okay, I'm fine with that idea. But this new idea that the liberals are proposing, that's crazy. And so the culture just moves ever more to the left.
Marriage used to be between a man and a woman, and then the left said marriage is a patriarchal institution and anyone should be able to get married because love is love. And the conservatives said, well, no, but I guess we'll go with gay marriage. And then the left said anyone can identify as anything. A man can identify as a woman. And conservatives said, no, men can't identify as women. Oh, well, I guess they kind of can, but as long as you're not doing it to children, that's fine. And so if you pay attention, you'll start to understand how this metaphor of the political ratchet always turning left underlies virtually all of the conservative arguments about why we need to constantly resist the left. However, there are some fatal problems with looking at things from this perspective, and I'm going to show you what those problems are, as well as provide you a better understanding of how to conceptualize the important and real process of cultural evolution. The first problem that you have is that conservative and progressive are technically relative terms, in that they have no meaning outside of the cultural and temporal context that they're in. Think about this issue when it comes to race relations. Most people would agree that the modern conservative position on race is that you should judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So-called progressives like Robin DiAngelo will actually mock this idea of colorblindness as being regressive and unsophisticated, and that striving for colorblindness is just a way to ignore the real disparities caused by systemic racism. But if you understand the nature of the political ratchet, you can look back and see, actually, just a few decades ago, it was the progressive position to strive for a colorblind society. And it was the conservatives who were arguing for segregation. And prior to that, the progressive position was just to abolish slavery, and the conservative position was to maintain slavery. What this means, and I don't see how anyone can disagree with this, is that today's conservatives, like Tucker Carlson or Matt Walsh, are at least ostensibly conserving principles that once were considered progressive, until that past culture ratcheted to the left and those progressive ideas became the new status quo. And herein lies the problems that doom everyone who calls themselves a hardcore conservative. The only thing approximating a true conservative perspective, one that would be free of any turning of the political ratchet, would be that of religious fundamentalism, in which a literal interpretation of some unchanging sacred text serves as the permanent status quo and the objective moral standard by which all moral judgments are rendered. And this, of course, is a completely untenable perspective because it falls victim to the same problems that any religious fundamentalist has. Most notably, the paradox of having to inevitably apply a human, i.e. subjective, interpretation to a so-called objective text.
That's really not the claim that religious fundamentalists make. The claim they make is worse than that, because they claim the Quran, say, or the Bible for that matter, is the literal word of God. But more than that, they claim that their understanding of that word is correct, which means they conflate two things. Like, because you could imagine a situation where you had a book, and I'm not saying this is the case, it's an imaginative exercise, where you had a book that had all the answers, that was extraordinarily complicated. And so that when you read it, it wouldn't be obvious that you understood it. And so the fundamentalist claim is far worse. It's that not only is there an absolute reality, truth, embedded in the book, but that their particular take on that absolute reality is the absolute take on that book.
So unless you think children should be put to death for cursing their parents, or people should die for eating ham or whatever, then you have to acknowledge that some changing of the status quo, some leftward turning of the political ratchet is necessary to ensure that our moral sensibilities are appropriate for our current environment. And I'll explain in just a second the technical reason for why, if you're conservative, you need these political ratchet effects to occur if you want society to not collapse. But first, let me make fun of the progressives who make their own mistake in this entire formulation, which is that they do not seem to understand that there is a fatal distinction between progress and change. I know that many people watching this are victims of a systemically racist education system that only taught us about genocide when it occurred to white people in Europe, but never in places like China or Cambodia. But believe it or not, oftentimes the leftward turn of the political ratchet leads to utter destruction and cultural degradation. And a modern manifestation of this inability to distinguish between change and progress comes in the form of the laughably incoherent demands of the left-wing progressives who believe now that it is a extremely sophisticated moral position to believe that 13-year-old children should be able to consent to irreversible medical experimentation. And ironically, when it comes to things like race, the request for, BIPOC segregated spaces is actually closer to the position of the segregationists in the 60s. So how is this tension resolved between progressives who want to constantly change the status quo and conservatives who want to constantly maintain the status quo? By acknowledging that both perspectives are right some of the time. Conservatives seek to maintain the traditions that keep society stable, and progressives look at those traditions and look at those hierarchies, economic, cultural, or otherwise, and says, yeah, society might be working for some people, but a lot of people it's not working for, it's marginalizing. And both perspectives engage in dialogue to figure out what the proper solution is to that eternal problem.
You can be temperamentally conservative and temperamentally liberal, and those are valid viewpoints because there's a place for those viewpoints in the world. They can function as tools.
So what's the left for? The left is to remind those who are benefiting from the hierarchies that the hierarchy comes at a cost, and the cost is the clumping of people at the bottom, and that's an eternal cost, and it's not trivial. And so that's what the left should be properly focused on. The left should be providing the voice of those who are dispossessed by hierarchy. And the right should be saying, yeah, but the damn hierarchies are necessary. And they're not only necessary, but they're also productive. Then the left says, yes, but they tilt towards tyranny, and they can be occupied inappropriately by people who are playing games of power. Fair enough, the right has to take that into account. The hierarchy can rigidify and is likely to do that, and it can be taken over by people who are corrupt, and that's likely to happen. But it's okay because the dialogue could work out. The right can say, well, yeah, we need the damn hierarchies and they need to be buttressed, and the left can say, yes, but they have to be maintained properly so they don't deteriorate and degenerate.
So instead of thinking about the political ratchet effect as an inherently good or bad thing, think about adding this one dimension of the metaphor to understand it more completely. Think of society as a car traveling down a dirt road through time and space and getting the wear and tear of new obstacles, new technologies that change everything, and it constantly almost collapsing all the time. It's held together by nuts and bolts, and those nuts and bolts are constantly coming loose as time goes on. And so in order to keep society together, in order to keep the car functional, every now and then those fasteners, those nuts and bolts need to be tightened to the left. Although I guess righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, but you get the point. The progressive's job is to figure out how to turn the political ratchet to the left effectively so as to address the issues. And the conservative's job is to say, yes, you can turn the political ratchet, but not too far or else everything will break. A perfect example of this is what happens with the Second Amendment. The conservatives rightly point out that the Second Amendment was created for the purpose of arming citizens to resist government tyranny. And the progressives rightfully point out that with all kinds of new technology like rocket-propelled explosive devices, it makes sense to restrict the kind of arms that individual citizens are allowed to own. Exactly where the line is up for debate, and that's why we need dialogue and free speech. But to pretend that only one side is correct on that issue is a complete misunderstanding of why the progressive left and the conservative right exist to begin with. And so, as always, the correct answer lies somewhere in that sweet, sweet, golden center, baby. And if you disagree with me, whether you're on the right or the left, then feel free to email me and we can talk about it on the P.F. Jung morning stream, Saturdays and Sundays, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Central. But until then, I wish everyone good luck and Godspeed.